It's working.
Right. Can I introduce the speaker, please? So my name is Jörg Ober. I'm professor of health sciences in the Center of Health Research, for those who don't know me, and there are quite a few faces I don't know, so that's nice to see some new faces here. There is really, I cannot really introduce Josiah Ober appropriately. He has so many accolades, so many published so widely, so I'll leave this to him to introduce himself a little bit more, apart from saying that he's Constantine Mitsotakis, do I pronounce it rightly, professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. He's currently on a lecturing tour for quite a while, mostly in Edinburgh and in Cambridge. And we had the good luck, or I had the good luck really, to talk to Zoltan about some ideas which about how organizations develop and or our universities. And out of that, we suddenly had this idea, why don't we contact Josh and see whether we can invite him or whether he might be in Europe at one point and we could sort of piggyback and get him here without having to pay for an entire flight ticket from San Francisco to here. So I won't go into the details, but it's quite a long story back, and I think we are very, very pleased to have you here and to speak on an issue which is very close to the heart of quite a few people here at Brighton University and as much at Sussex University, where there is a lot of change going on, and perhaps we can glean some insight from you about what classic Athenian democracy can tell us for modern organizational development. But please correct me if I use the wrong terms. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much.
And
Jörg and Zoltan, for this invitation. I got interested in democracy a long time ago, especially studying it in terms of the ancient Greek world, and had through
better.
I had the good luck to work with a friend and a colleague who was also trained as a classicist, but became a professional management consultant in terms of thinking about how some of my own work and some work of other scholars on the classical Greek world might translate into thinking about contemporary organizations. So I'll talk mostly about Greece at this point, but at the end I'll talk a bit about organizations. If at any point it gets confusing, if I'm going too fast, just stop me. We're a small enough group, we can do this informally. I don't have to do this as a continuous lecture. So thinking about institutions and democracy and robustness, we have to come up with a definition for democracy. The usual definition is going to be something like majority rule, and that's not what I'm concerned with. Majority rule is an important mechanism, but it certainly isn't the only mechanism important for democracy. So instead of just majority rule, I'm going to be talking about a regime that is a set of rules and then associated behaviors that promote a group's capacity to do things together. So that's the core ideas. That's what democracy is about. It's not about individual preference satisfaction only. It's about identifying commonly held interests and goals of that group. It's not primarily in its original meaning about human rights, but rather about citizenship and about the costs and benefits that come with citizenship and the kind of duties that citizens have to one another. And finally, it's not just a matter for states. We tend to associate democracy as a form of government for a nation state, but in fact, democracy is adaptable for any kind of purposeful organization, an organization that has specific ends, universities among them. So defining democracy, we could do it either from first principles, out of political theory, or you can go to the Greek terminology. The Greeks made up the word, and you come pretty much to the same definition, that is collective and limited self-governance by a relatively extensive, relatively diverse body of citizens. The regime aimed at non-tyranny, that is not having a single autocratic center of authority, at security, that able to, the organization able to maintain itself, and relative prosperity to achieve its ends. As I say, either way, through political theory or through Greek history, you'll get to pretty much the same position. What do we mean then by robustness or stability? Not ossification, not resistance to change. But rather, we're talking about an agreement, and a relatively stable agreement, about principles, about practices, about processes that are shared by the members of the organization, and on the value of the ends that are sought by the organization. So ultimately, to be a citizen of an organization, as opposed to just being an employee or just being a subject of a state, is to share in these principles and practices and processes, and to be attached to the values that are the value of the ends that are sought. So regime stability in a mutable environment, and mutable environments are what organizations exist in, requires a capacity to dynamically respond to changes. So in order to have an organization that works, you can't just simply say, we've got the rules right for once and for all, and that's it. You have to dynamically respond. And this requires a willingness to experiment. Not all of the changes you're going to make are going to be successful. Experiments will sometimes, indeed, often end up failing. But that's part of democracy. Democracy is about fallibility. It's about recognizing that, in fact, some experiments will fail. So to be dynamically stable, then democracy requires rules, and those rules have to be clear. That is, the rules can't be so complex, so multiple that nobody really knows what they are. The rules have to be based on shared interests, and they have to be reliably backed by habitual social behaviors. That is, people have to act in ways that will support, will defend the rules. And those rules must allow for the violation of the rules to be punished, whether that violation is by officials or whether it's by other powerful social actors, if it is a political leader who is acting outside constitutional authority, or whether it's some powerful individual who is breaking the agreed upon rules. If those violations can't be fairly reliably punished, in other words, if the citizens don't act to respond to violations, then there may as well not be rules in the first place. And finally, the rules have to limit any absolutist tendencies of the citizens as collective rulers. So if we say that democracy is collective rule, that collective rule can't be itself a form of authoritarian autocracy. The rules have to be limiting majoritarian tyranny, or any tendency towards majoritarian tyranny. So why would you want to bother with a democracy in an organization? There are various reasons I think that you would. Insofar as you value freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, all of these obviously within a university setting of primary importance. As long as you value political equality of votes and of the right to participate in making rules and adjusting rules, And it's good for sustaining conditions of civic dignity, that is, mutual respect, mutual recognition, non-humiliation, that is, a commitment not to impose humiliating conditions of existence on others, and treating one another as adults instead of children. So I think that democracy is very good for each of these things. It requires these conditions and therefore sustains these conditions. And furthermore, it promotes the effective sharing and aggregation of useful knowledge and innovation and learning across established domains. So this is, I think, once again, especially important for any kind of organization that is involved with learning, any organization that is concerned with knowledge, as obviously universities are and must be. My two hats, I have an appointment in a political science department at Stanford, and also an appointment in the classics department there. So my goal in life is putting together social science with Greek history. So classical Greece is an interesting place when we are thinking about forms of political organization. Because it has a very distinctive institutional development. It's a very long-lived ecology of many small and relatively democratic states. So this is a map that just scatters the known states of the Greek world across the Mediterranean. Furthermore, Greek history is remarkably data-rich. There is an awful lot of evidence that we have for the world of Greece before the Roman takeover. Due to the survival of texts that most of you will be familiar with one way or another, intensive archaeological field work over a very long period of time, and recent encyclopedic work, for example, this great inventory of archaic and classical polis, which some of my students have helped me digitize, and the maps and so on, you'll see, come out of the digitization of this great compendium of information about the classical Greek world. So the Greek world is, I think, best understood as a market-like ecology of states. It's a large ecology of many different independent or semi-independent states that acts in some ways rather like a market of firms, for example. Greece is the largest, longest lasting, best documented ecology of city-states that we have in world history, much bigger, longer lasting than, for example, the Renaissance Italian city-states. And it's an example of peer polity interaction. In other words, these city-states treated one another as the same kind of entity. They treated one another as states. They had diplomatic relations of various sorts. The history of the Greek world is particularly interesting because it allows us to test what we can call neo-Hobbesian claims for the economic value or indeed the necessity of extreme centralization. So basically, Thomas Hobbes said you need a sovereign. That without a strong sovereign at the center of any organization, you will not be able to have any kind of effective cooperation. The Greek history challenges that really very common assumption about the necessity for strong centralization in order to have effective state performance. So if we think about the shape of this world, a world in which we have hundreds, probably about 1,100 city-states, Plato has a famous quote. He said, "The earth is very large, and we Greeks live in a small part of it, about the sea, that is the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, like ants or frogs around a pond." And so this gives you a sense of how Plato could imagine this world as being, these ant mass or frogs around a pond. But the Greek city-states are not all of the same size by any means. They're very different places from one another. And if we break them out, we can divide the polis into 7 different categories of size. We don't have exact numbers for any Greek city-state, but we can estimate fairly reasonably based on archaeological and text evidence. And across the entire Greek world, this 1,100 states is divided into places that are really, some of them very tiny, with a population estimate of something like 1,000 people, and others much larger with populations in the hundreds of thousands. There are relatively many very small Greek city-states. Most of them, about 4 out of 5, are this sort of category 1 through 3, so population average of not over about 7,000. But on the other hand, 2/3 of Greeks lived in middle to large size city-states. So it's, although we can sort of get ourselves into thinking, oh, all Greeks, or most Greek city-states are so tiny, therefore most Greeks must have lived in tiny states. It's not the case. Most Greeks lived in states of tens to hundreds of thousands of persons. So once again, if you think about these as modern organizations, rather than modern nation states, we begin to think about an ecology of very many organizations, ranging in size from really quite small to what would be a very large purposeful organization in the modern world. Okay, so just another way of looking at most polis being small, but most Greeks living in a relatively large polis. We can divide the, once again, just trying to think about the sort of the shape of this world. We could distribute the city-states by size on just a standard distribution in the top graph, with the number of city-states on the horizontal, or on the vertical axis, and then the size on the horizontal axis. And as you can see, that once again, most of them are very small, and just a few of them very large. And by using the evidence in the inventory, we can also sort them by prominence. And we see very much the same kind of shape, with most of them we know very little about them. They're not prominent, they're not famous, so there's not much information available. And a few of them with a great deal of information available. The really famous ones that everyone has heard of, Athens, Syracuse, Sparta, are all way over on the right tail, right? They're very, very big, very, very well known. But to understand the Greek world, understand how this market-like ecology works, we have to think about small and great city-states alike. We have to think about them at the same time. And that's what Herodotus, a historian from the 5th century BC, said in his histories. He was able to simply imagine this in his head, of course. He lived there, he traveled there. But for us, I think, having some of these graphics allow us to think about how this ecology really looked. Okay, the interesting thing in terms of performance about the Greek world overall is that during the classical period, during the period in which Plato and Aristotle were living, the Greek world achieved a peak both in terms of the level of consumption, so how much people had to live on, and also the size of the population. So the dark line is consumption. Consumption of 1 means that the people in question are just at the level of starvation. Okay, so at 2, you're at 2 times basic subsistence on up. Most of Greek history, people have lived close to the level of subsistence. So that is the pre-modern normal of the Greek world, is rather like the pre-modern normal of most of the rest of the world. Most people have lived very near to the edge of basically failure. 1 to 1.5 times a subsistence, basically. up to 2 times the good. In the Greek world, it's much more than that. This graph is multiplying the population times consumption to give you basically development index. And the point is that in the time of Homer and the time of Byron in the 8th century BC and in the 19th century AD, and in most of the period throughout, the Greek world was depopulated and people were living near subsistence. In the period in between, in the time of Plato and Aristotle, the red box, it was a very different world, a world in which relatively high consumption and high population. A population that wasn't reached, by the way, until the late 19th century, and various other measures weren't reached again until the early 20th century. Urbanization, for example, level of urbanization at the time of Aristotle wasn't reached probably until the 1920s, 1930s in the Greek world. In the time of Aristotle, about a third of Greeks lived in towns, that is, areas that were concentrated within city walls, functioning properly as towns of 5,000 or more. We compare the really very highly urbanized Roman Empire at its height, maybe 11% of people living in such towns. France, right before the Revolution, about the same number. England and Wales in the late 17th century, about the same number. England and Wales doesn't achieve the density of urbanization of the Greek world in the time of Aristotle until the turn of the 19th century. But once again, it's just to give you a sense of this is a world that wasn't a primitive, simple world. It's actually a remarkably high-performing world, generally. The Greek city-states, for all their high-performing, tended to have a lot of regime change. There was not a terribly stable world. Indeed, the expected model of the Greek world, as for that matter, the expected model for the modern world, modern nations, is frequent regime change, sometimes violent regime change. In the Greek world, cycling between oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny, a typical regime lasting less than 2 human generations. There are many examples of this. What is causing all of this regime change? Basically, a number of things, but exogenous shocks, change in external conditions, change in the environment, war leads to conflict between empowered rulers and would-be citizens, people who are denied full or would like to achieve exclusive participation rights, and so we get struggle between elites and masses, basically yielding various, in some cases, violent changes in the fundamental constitutional rules. But some states, some Greek states, had a very persistent set of rules with relatively few or even no changes. There are cases of oligarchic persistence, which we're not going to be worrying about today. What I'm interested in is the example of Athens, which is a particularly notable case of democratic resilience or robustness or stability. So, how do we explain the robustness of regimes? How do we their capacity to resist change, even in the face of exogenous shocks? Well, Aristotle says these are not direct Greek quotes. This is just summing up his points. Aristotle says that a regime will be robust to shock if citizens have good reasons to cooperate rather than to fight each other. So they need to have actual reasons to stay within their current set of rules. The right institutions will give citizens good reasons to cooperate rather than fighting. And institutionalized behaviors that support the rules will become strong cooperative habits when the goals of individuals are compatible with the ends sought by the organization. So basically, this is what economists call incentive compatibility. if my goals as an individual are consistent with the ends that the organization is seeking, and the rules are therefore helping me achieve my ends and the organization to achieve its ends, then there's a compatibility between what I want and what the regime wants, and I have no reason to fight. On the other hand, Aristotle makes a point that this requires education in terms of people understanding the differences between their actual interests, identifying what my interests really are, and my preferences of the moment. So Aristotle thinks civic education is really quite important. So the general hypothesis in the background of this talk is that Aristotle was right. This is the right way to think about organizations. So we look at a case study of Athens, and this is Athens in the late 6th to the late 4th century BCE, so the later archaic period through the late classical period, for those of you who think in terms of the classical world. In this period, democracy at Athens is positively correlated with high performance of the state overall. The democratic regime is relatively robust against shocks, for example, military failure or military success for that matter. The hypothesis is that there are particular institutions that will help us explain Athens' high performance and the robustness of the regime. Those institutions are ones that fostered trust among the residents of the state and built social capital among the residents of the state by incentivizing bridging across Strongtime networks. So this is sort of, if you haven't done network theory, this is slightly technical language, but I'll show you what I mean as we go along. And we'll be looking at a couple of examples of trust-building institutions, quasi-federalism, and the Associated Democratic Council of 500. So here is the Greek world, right? This is a map of the Greek world on the left, and then in the box, the territory of Attica, which is the territory controlled, the home territory of the state of Athens. So in that home territory, we have about, well, it's a territory of about 2,500 kilometers squared, with a population of roughly 250,000 people. In the period that we're concerned with, democracy is, as I suggested, a driver of high performance. The empirics here, that we'll go through with some charts, is that the development of democratic changes in the direction of democracy tends to lead state capacity growth. So first democracy, then state capacity growth. Democratic Athens outperforms its various rivals, despite the costs, which are not inconsiderable, of democratic participation. The hypothesis is that participatory institutions, democratic institutions, are what promotes this higher performance, so that we're getting high performance because of democracy, not in spite of it. And the mechanism, so how do you connect the hypothesis with the outcome, with the empirics, is that the organization of useful knowledge is what produces benefits that exceed the costs. Right? So benefits arise from a balance of institutional innovation and routinization, that is, capturing the advantages of learning, of learning how to do things. So democracy also drives the robustness of the regime, so we both get performance, but we also get robustness or stability. Here the empirics are that democracy at Athens proves to be quite robust to shocks for 180 years. In other words, it stays pretty much democratic for most of that 180-year period, despite divergent interests, or at least material interests, of ordinary citizens and the elites. The hypothesis is that participatory democratic institutions are what drives or what promotes robustness. So just as these institutions drive performance, they also do drive robustness or stability. And here the mechanism is citizen participation in institutions, which builds social networks across, between elites and non-elites, among citizens, builds a culture, a cooperative political culture. People have developed identities, ways of thinking about things, habitual behaviors, and all of this is driving, ultimately, incentive compatibility. So people begin to see that their interests really are the interests of the organization, and the rules are the ones that will allow them to achieve the ends that they, in fact, want to achieve. So it's important to recognize when thinking about democracy that democracy is costly, right? To have a democracy does mean taking on certain costs. So in this population of 250,000, we have adult male citizens. The Greeks did not ever extend citizenship to non-males, and fairly rarely to non-natives. So we've got to have about 30,000 of the total population as citizens. But of those 30,000, a lot of the time of those people were spent in doing the work of democracy. They could have been doing something else. So sitting in the assembly, engaging in, as jurors in law courts, taking a year's service on the council, or a year's service on various executive boards. So there's lots of time and energy that you think, gosh, that could be go into economically productive activity that is going into running this system. And it's, as I say, these are genuine costs. We can count them up a bit. But at any rate, it costs something like 100 talents as a standard measurement of monetary value. A talent is a lump. If it's a talent of silver, it's a lump of silver about the size of your head. So it costs about 100 of those to run this democracy for a year out of total state revenues, maximum, a maximum of about 10 times that. So the democracy is not inexpensive. Are these costs very high in terms of opportunity? I mean, in other words, would the state have done better? Did it not have democracy? Could the opportunities that were lost to citizen activity in democracy have been better recouped otherwise? And the answer is no, because the opportunities lost to participation are in fact repaid as benefits both to individuals and to the state, arising from their very participation. So it's not just that participating isn't a complete cost, it's also at the same time a benefit both to the individual and to the organization. Athenian democracy and state capacity over time. What I'm going to do is just give you a couple of graphs. These are very quite simple. I'm going to put democracy on a 15-point scale, and equally weighted for the level of citizenship, so what percentage of the native male citizen body has active citizenship. How much power does the demos have? So now we bring in majority rule as a part of democracy, but not as the whole of it. And the authority of law, rule of law, so the reliability of procedural rules. So we're arbitrarily weighting those all equally, putting it on a 15-point scale. And then we'll have a capacity scale that, once again, these are just proxies of overall state capacity. So the state's ability to engage in military activity, public building, and domestic programs. So this is the democracy score. We're going from about 600 BC on the far left side of the horizontal scale to about 250 BC on the right-hand scale. And you see, basically it's high in the center and low on the ends. And here is the state capacity ranking, and once again, high in the center and low on the ends. And then we put them together, so now the dotted line is democracy, the solid line is state capacity, and you can see they tend to track one another. And if you look at it carefully, you see that the democracy line tends to lead. It's further to the left, right? Earlier, because this is BC. It's a timeline on the bottom, on the horizontal axis. So the democracy leads capacity. So if we look at the overall performance of Athens against its rivals, once again, we just have to come up with proxies, but the proxies are I think, absurd ones. So we can look at public buildings, various kinds of international activity, prominence, fame, the metric I showed you before, size of territory, and the bottom line is Athens outperforms even its most prominent rivals. These are just the most high-performing of the city-states, at least by this metric. So we've got a whole lot of city-states that would go down to a much, much smaller ranking than this, very close to 0. This is just the 20 or so highest ranking. Athens is even more dominant when we look at various other things. So this is how many times does the name of a given city-state, the name of a given polis, appear in Greek literature, right? And the black line is the 5th century BC, and then the time of the so-called golden age of Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides, and so on. And the 4th century is the age of Plato and Aristotle. You can see that compared to the various other rival states, the same ones that we saw last time, Athens is even more dominant, even coming up more often in Greek literature, the name coming up more often in Greek literature than any other city-state by far. Now, somebody's going to say, who's done a little bit of classics, say, aha, but that's because almost all Greek literature in the 5th century and 4th century was actually written in Athens. So of course they're going to be mentioning the name of Athens a lot, in which case I'm going to say yes, and that's part of the point. Athens is really a very, very prominent place, that if you're going to be a major player in Greek culture in the 5th and 4th centuries, you're probably going to choose to do your work in Athens. So who is benefiting from all of this state performance? As it turns out, the non-elite are doing pretty well. This is a graphic that is basically attempting to work out the pay scale of manual laborers in many pre-modern societies until basically the 18th century. So we're going from on the far left, the time of Hammurabi, to the far right, the time of Immanuel Kant. And what you can see is in the blue box, before about the 14th century, most of the dots are pretty low. That is, wages, most places where they can be measured are relatively low. This is measuring the standard units of wheat, liters of wheat per day. It's the way that economic historians of pre-modernity tend to do business. We have two observations from Athens, from the 5th century and the 4th century, and in both cases Athens is a standout from this, especially in the 4th century, at the time of Aristotle and Plato. Babylon is another interesting standout. The difference here is in Athens, these are all pre-tax figures. And in Athens, the taxes are uniquely on the wealthy. In Babylon, the taxes are uniquely on the poor. So if we were to do this post-tax, Babylon would go considerably down compared to the two Athens. So saying, just how good is that? How high were wages in Athens in the time of Aristotle? About as good as they were in the Golden Age of Holland. And that's as good as they were any time in Europe until the 19th century. So Athens seems to be performing for the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale extremely well, surprisingly well, as well as the most prominent economy of pre-modern Europe. Furthermore, unlike Holland in the Golden Age, income equality was relatively low in Athens. There were a few stunningly wealthy people in Holland. Not so much the case in Athens. There certainly were rich people. It's nothing like a socialist paradise, but the inequality is sort of compared to other pre-modern societies. The Gini coefficient, the standard way of measuring inequality, in this case of income, is really surprisingly low. And it's even more striking, I think, when we move away from the Gini coefficient. Those of you who've done economic studies know that the Gini is the standard way that inequality gets studied in modern societies. The problem is that the Gini isn't as good for pre-modern societies because so much income is necessarily captured by bare subsistence. So the amount of income that is captured in a modern economy by just staying alive is relatively small compared to the amount of the economy that is captured by just staying alive in a pre-modern society. Branko Milanovic and some of his colleagues have come up with a really neat measure that they call the inequality abstraction ratio. Basically, the idea is, suppose that the top 10% were to extract as much as could be extracted from the rest of the society. In other words, everybody else is at subsistence level of 1. Right? And you can't put them down below 1 because they start starving to death, and then there's not much more to extract anymore. At least you can't do that for long. So the question is how close can you get to that? And if you get to that, so the top 10% are getting everything, and everybody else is just at the level of starvation, then you're at 100. And then you can rank societies according to this. Athens comes out surprisingly low. The only one that has been really measured in terms of the comparisons that we've been looking at is England and Wales in the 17th century, and it's still substantially higher. So once again, as with the Gini coefficient, low is good if you think inequality is bad. And we can measure this, put it on a graph. This is Milanovic's graph. The curve that you see, the IPF, inequality possibility frontier curve, is that 100%. So if you were to the up and to the left of that curve, people are dying. Right? People are starving to death. If you're down and to the right of that, then the people who are not elite are getting a bigger share. And you can see Athens is further down and further to the left than most of the comparisons. It just suggests that Athens, compared to other pre-modern societies, is relatively equal or relatively less unequal. This is, by the way, the entire society. This includes men and women and children and slaves and residents, not just citizens. Okay, so cost and benefits of democratic institutions. Who pays the material costs? Who's really paying for this society? Well, in the 5th century, the age of Pericles, elite Athenians paid some taxes, but not too much, because there was an empire, and the imperial subjects basically supported the whole thing. But in the 4th century, the time of Plato and Aristotle, there was no more empire. The empire had been lost. And so it's elite Athenians who are paying the bulk of the taxes, along with traders who are paying indirect taxes, harbor fees, and so on. Who reaps the benefits? Well, non-elite citizens reap a lot of the benefits, as we've seen. The elite non-elite are doing quite well in Athens. They're free, they're relatively equal, they avoid elite capture, they get paid for public service, and wages are pretty good. Elite Athenians also benefit, but only if and when benefits of enhanced state performance are greater than the costs that they're paying in taxes, right? So if you're an elite, you're kind of saying, gosh, this isn't the best world I could possibly have, because wouldn't it be nice to push a little closer to 100, you know, and that inequality possibility frontier extracts more of the wealth of those poor. So when shocks reduce state capacity and performance, right, when Athens from time to time doesn't do so well in terms of state capacity, then elite Athenians' interest would seem to be to move to oligarchy. Why should we put up with paying for this democracy, which is no longer giving us a high-performing state? Non-elite Athenians' interest would seem to still be democracy. They still want to be free and equal, and help state pay and so on. So the expected result is that we'd have frequent regime change. You'd have regime change when you have shocks. Okay, so that's the expected result. So are we going to get the expected result? Not to nearly the extent that we would expect. So here we have the red, this is basically a timeline going from 595 or before, so the beginning of the 6th century BC down to the end of the 4th century. And we see in the early period, Athens, like many other states, tends to vary between oligarchy and tyranny. In 508, there's a revolution, Democratic Revolution, and Athens enters a long period of relatively stable democracy. There are two brief interruptions, basically 1 year or several month oligarchic regimes, 411-10 and 404, but in each case the democracy comes back, and it's not until the Macedonian takeover after the victories of Alexander the Great that oligarchy comes back and varies with democracy. So the question is, how do we explain the robustness of democracy for this long period where it's mostly blue? Okay, that's the question. And here's once again just visualizing it on the thing we've already seen, this long, relatively democratic era. So there are times in which there are shocks, performance failures, and followed by ephemeral oligarchies. So we have both the dotted line of democracy and the solid line of capacity crash at the 2 points I've noted with the little red markers. But notice how quickly democracy recovers and how quickly capacity recovers. So in both cases, capacity goes right back up again as soon as democracy is restored, and is restored very quickly. And there are various other times in Greek history that we don't have to go through because this isn't really about history, but in which there are really some fairly substantial shocks, right? Capacity goes down. For example, the Persians burn the Acropolis and basically lay waste to Athens in the Persian Wars, and yet democracy remains unaffected. The democracy remains with them. So, well, we're not getting the result we expected. That's the point. We thought, good heavens, when capacity goes down, the elite should be kicking in and saying it's time for, civil war. We should try to push an oligarchy. We're not getting that. So why is that? Once again, the basic argument, Athenian institutions are driving both performance and robustness. Performance through institutional innovation and learning, and there's lots of examples of how Athenian institutions both reflect the tendency towards institutional innovation and capture the value of learning. So in law and legislation, in various executive boards, in systems of taxation and military recruitment, we see the Athenians using the same background principles. They aren't sacrificing the core principles of democracy. So the principles are stable, but the actual way in which they're manifest in particular institutions are dynamically responding to a changing environment. Democratic institutions drive the organization of knowledge, drives performance is the argument, and in robustness, looking at these two examples of quasi-federalism and the Council of 500, democratic institutions help to the development of networks, a particular kind of citizen culture, and this forces robustness. So once again, going back to Athens, Notice on the lower right, the little says prosocial, right? So that's where we're going. A little tiny village on the coast of Attica, and there we are in Procyon, not ancient Procyon, unfortunately, but this is where it was. A typical small village on the east coast of Attica. Population in antiquity maybe 700. So this is just one of the constituent villages of Athenian territory. Perhaps 180 male citizens. The premise of what I'm going to argue now is that Athenian villages were characterized before the democracy and even after the development of the democracy initially by strong tie networks. That is to say that a person's friends are likely to be one another's friends. Now this is what Mark Granovetter, in some classic work on social networks, made a distinction between strong networks in which everybody knows each other, and everybody, friend networks in which everybody else is one another's friend. These strong networks promote intensive local interaction, but they discourage interregional bridging. It's hard for a strong tie network to connect to anybody outside that network, because you connect to people outside the network, gee, they're not all our friends. I mean, how are you going to do that? We know each other. We really know each other. We trust each other because we've really got our eyes on each other. Connect with those people, well, I don't know them so well. So strong tie networks tend to be very inward-looking and not very innovative. Okay, so we have a public action problem. Building bridges from one strong tie network, the residents of the village of Procyon, to another strong tie network, say the residents of a different village, is costly to individuals. I don't want to do it, I know everybody in Procyon. I go out there and meet somebody else. I don't know those people. They might not like me. They might be mean. Anyway, I won't know them. I don't know. Why should I trust them? And if the costs are greater than the benefits, then we're going to get very limited bridging. We're going to get limited cooperation. Cooperation is going to stay mostly local, and the capacity of the overall organization, say of Athens, is going to be limited. And basically, the people of Procyon stick to the people of Procyon. They don't want to deal with people in other villages. You can see this is not going to be good overall. So what's the solution? You want to create conditions in which social entrepreneurs see big potential benefits in paying the costs of bridging between these strong tie local networks. Right? So that's the incentive compatibility once again. So how do you get that? And this is not, this is not like some genius sort of said, gosh, I'm going to take my time machine and go talk to Mark Granovetter and figure out, how should I organize democracy in Athens in 508 BC. This is unexpected knock-on effects, but unexpected and very positive knock-on effects. So in the wake of this revolution of 508 BC, in order to try to simply avoid the whole thing falling apart very quickly, and in order to allow for military recruitment, the leaders of the revolution created 10 new artificial tribes on this extremely complex map. Each tribe was drawn from existing villages, the dots on the map, different sizes depending on how big they are, and each tribe draws from 3 different regions. So draws some from the blue area, the so-called coastal region, the red area, the inland region, and the urban yellow area as well. So each of these 10 completely made-up artificial tribes is going to have a membership that is drawn from these multiple different regions. So people who don't know each other. It goes, if you imagine it like this, we have the polis of Athens with its circa 250,000 people, made up of citizens and various women, children, foreigners, and slaves. The citizens are divided into these 10 tribes, right, at the next level down. And if we just take tribe number 3, we can see that tribe number 3 draws from a group of villages from the coastal region, the inland region, and the urban region. So basically, now if you are in the period after 508, it gets announced, congratulations, now you're a proud member of the Pandionis tribe. Your ancestor, come to find out, is a guy called Pandion, and your fellow tribesmen are all these people from these different villages, most of whom you've never even heard of. So if you're from Prosocial, where the yellow arrow is, congratulations. Now your fellow villages are from places like Candathaneon and Angela and Lower Paeania and so on, and you're thinking, good heavens, who are these people? Okay, so you're furthermore going to be having to deal with them if you happen to be chosen by lottery as a member of the Athenian Council, because in order to govern the new post-revolutionary democracy, the leaders of the revolution create a new council of 500 councilors selected by lot, each for a one-year term, and the council is made up of 10 teams, each drawn from one tribe, 50 men drawn from the multiple villages or neighborhoods that make up that tribe. So it looks like this. Here's a team of 50, right? So these are 50 guys. And here's, you imagine it from Prosocial. Prosocial is a dinky little place. The representation is by population. And so Prosocial sends 3 people to the meeting of the first council. And you have to imagine, there you are, a guy from Prosocial, and suddenly there's 2 guys you know, because we're assuming it's all Strongtime networked, but a whole bunch of people, 47, that you probably have never met. So there's our guy. So the little arrow pointing to it, we have to give somebody a name to make this seem real. Posidippus, there really is a Posidippus of Prosocial. We do not know enough about his life to really say exactly who he knows and so on. This is a model of networking rather than something that we can get from actual evidence on the ground. But certainly this is the size and the arrangement of the group of councilors from the Pandionis tribe. So we're imagining here, so each of these are little village groups, right? The village groups are of different sizes, so it's just that represented now in Strongtime networks. And so we have relatively few bridging ties. The dashed lines are meant to be existing. So a few people know a few other people, but not very many. There are lots of structural holes. This is a term that was introduced by Ron Birch to network theory. Structural holes separate these deemed contingents, and therefore it's hard to get information from one little cluster of guys to another little cluster of guys, even though you're on the same organization, right? There you are on the council. Maybe you're all sitting in seats together, like something like this. But you have to imagine there's those 3 Prosocial guys sitting over here, and so on. So how are you going to get people to bridge across those ties? The problem is that those structural holes limit the information flow. You're not going to get done what you need to do in this team of people. Makes a new policy for Athens in the face of the external threats that Athens faces. On the other hand, it's an individual opportunity. Okay, so in other words, if Posidippus has the kind of intuitions that I could make something of myself by a situation like this. So we sort of imagine that Posidippus is a social entrepreneur. So the problem is that each member of the council sits for only 1 year, has relatively little chance of reappointment. So there are relatively low rewards in terms of becoming a sort of a full-time politician. You're not going to get that out of networking. So you get elected to the American Senate or House of Representatives. Boy, networking is a good idea. You want to stay in there for a long time, maybe the rest of your life. That Posidippus doesn't get to do that. But we're assuming that Prosocius is the least advantaged counselor in terms of social economic standing, and therefore he has the greatest incentive to seek new sources of social capital. In other words, with Prosocius, let's say Prosocius has the relatively difficult luck of having 3 daughters who wants to get married to people. It's a dowry society, and he doesn't have a lot of money for a dowry. He'd like to have his daughters marry up. Suddenly, he's in this world, on this team with 50 other guys. Some of them would make really good matches for his daughter, but he doesn't have the money, to offer dowries in material sense. He's got to basically convince people that he's got something else. He has some other kind of capital that he basically needs to build social capital. So once again, so just the assumption is that Prosocius or somebody in this group basically sees this, sees that by building bridges, by beginning to network, I can become a player. And this is what Ron Burke shows, that structural holes, people who bridge structural holes do get real material payoffs for doing so. Their salaries are higher, controlling for everything else. So basically, Prosocius sees the opportunity, bridges across the structural holes, starts networking like mad, glad-handing, trying to basically pay the costs in terms of taking some risks, connecting with other people, and therefore gaining information and social capital. So once again, this is what Bert showed, is that people who gain that information, gain social capital, do in fact become very important members of the organization, and their payoffs are very real for them. The organization ultimately recognizes that. Now, Prosocius is not going to be the only one to figure that out. People are going to say, hey, that Prosocius guy, he's doing really well. I could do some of that myself. And so as others imitate, the extended network of this tribal contingent, this team, grows relatively dense with bridging ties, and therefore information, knowledge can flow across this team. So what's known among the city people can relatively easily be known by the coastal people and the inland people. When we're trying to make policy, we're trying to design some kind of policy, we can now put together what is known across the whole team, rather than just one guy having to say, look, I'm really smart, I have the best idea. Now, you put together what is known from diverse knowledge sets. So the council builds on federalism to share knowledge among citizens. So this is basically a federalized system, taking a bunch of discrete units and trying to put them together in a way that you can actually do business across an extended territory. Each 50-person team includes people from different regions who know different things. This teamwork towards a common goal for the good of the organization builds trust and encourages the sharing of operation. But once again, the information, again, the idea is it's incentive compatible. Prosocius is not imagined as some grand altruist. He's not imagined as somebody who just falls in love with the idea of Athens. He wants to get his daughters dowered, but it's actually his personal interests and the interests of the organization are nicely aligned. And so teamwork ultimately teaches the group to listen to one another, to listen to who among them is relatively expert about whatever it may be, teaches them who is expert in what field, and ultimately the idea is this doesn't only work at the level of the teams of 50, it works at the level of the entire council of 500, right? So I don't have it's too messy to try to do networks for 500 people, but you get the idea. So the premise then is that council service builds social capital over time and space. Remember, you're only serving for 1 year, and that means quite a lot of Athenians out of a given 30,000 at a given time are going to have at one time in their life done council service and had a chance, therefore, to engage in this kind of networking. And the networks begin to build over generations. Your father served on the council. You could begin to buy into his networks, your grandfather, and so on. Bridges then become more robust over time, over generations, and across space, across these demes, these villages, and their tribes. and the habits of interaction become more ingrained. It's easier to do. You don't have to just start out saying, hey, I'm a clever social entrepreneur. It becomes simply part of what you do as a counselor. Densely bridged interregional networks build overall state-level social capacity, trust, social capital. And networks foster democratic citizen identity. They help in coordination. They ultimately promote ideological identification with the democracy. You see that, in fact, the democracy is good for you as an individual. Your service as a counselor actually doing something that is valuable for you. It's not just a cost that you have to pay. It's also a benefit. It's a benefit for you and a benefit for your state. So each generation of Athenians then has a greater store of social capital, greater investment in preservation of democracy. Incentive compatibility is reinforced. The regime becomes more robust to shocks. And when extreme exogenous shocks do precipitate collapse of institutions, oligarchy fails to gain deep support. Resistance to oligarchy emerges very quickly and gains momentum. Oligarchic regimes are ephemeral. Democracy is persistent. This is not only an Athenian story. If the story is right, other city-states should be noticing this and saying, we want in. That's really working for Athens. That would work for us. And in fact, the trend across time in the Greek world is for transitions towards democracy rather than transitions towards oligarchy. They go both ways. This is a world in which there's lots of regime instability. But if we look at total transitions from oligarchy, away from oligarchy towards democracy, 85, towards total transitions from democracy towards oligarchies, 59, you could do the various breakdowns. The bottom line is oligarchy is doing relatively less well. So is tyranny. Tyranny never disappears out of the Greek world, right? There's always the possibility of just having one person run everything. This chart, one of my former students, gives you a sense of the sort of the tyranny line from the 7th century BC to the end of the 4th century BC. And here's the democracy line in blue and the oligarchy line in the first half of the 6th century to the second half of the 5th century. A lot of oligarchy in the Greek world, right? Democracy is not the most common in this period. But by the time we get to the age of Aristotle, oligarchy is crashing. And democracy is outdoing oligarchy in terms of the total number of observations of regimes. So the Athenian model then is being imitated, it appears, through the Greek world. That democracy is actually proving to be adaptive in this ecology of states, right? So if you think about it in biological terms, democracy turns out to be an adaptive behavior. Should we think about Athenian-style democracy in a modern state? It doesn't make a lot of sense, frankly. It's implausible given the huge differences in scale, the necessity for representative forms of government rather than direct citizen participation. But, as I suggested at the beginning, nation-states are not the only modern organizations that could potentially benefit from building bridges, from creating networks, through growing trust, social capital, through gaining the advantages of innovation and learning that come when people are willing to share what they know with people they trust, right? So that's the basic idea. It's certainly the case that non-state organizations in the modern world, in fact, do some of their work more or less on a citizen model. For example, big partnerships like McKinsey and Company, the professional services firm, management consultants. It's a gigantic, thousands and thousands of partners. Wouldn't be a huge city-state, but it would be a good-sized one at this point. And it runs on a partnership rather than a top-down CEO model. Many firms are seeking to create flatter organization models, basically trying to reduce distance between the people at the top of the management structure and the people who are producing the value for the organization. And they're doing this in order to allow the organization to achieve its ends, to increase flexibility, agility, learning. And they're doing it because there's an increasing recognition by innovative firms that something like democracy, not as majority rule, but as the capacity of people to do things together, to together work towards common ends, ultimately enhances the business model of the firm. So there are lots of examples of this. Zynga is one. There are, some people have suggested Warren Buffett. There are whole organizations that are basically meant to look at new modes of doing business. WorldBlue.com is one of them. You can go to its website and see what you think about these various relatively open. Once again, this is not pure democracy. This is by far from it, but it is using a democratic, quasi-democratic institution, Zappos, one of the hugely successful shoe selling businesses, is a famous one of these. So what I just gave you was boiled down from a couple of books that I've written. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I'm not here to sell you books. I'm here to try to suggest that it really is worthwhile thinking about the ways in which organizations could actually do better by embracing what is in some ways a democratic model.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. I think we'll have time for some questions at least, even though we run a bit longer than originally planned. If somebody needs to go, please just do so. Don't feel inhibited. But yes, over for comments and questions. Yes, please.
To what extent do you think that the participatory budgeting schemes of places like Sao Paulo can help to make state institutions more democratic?
Yeah. So this is one of these. If you actually get out of non-political or non-state organizations and look at sections of political organizations, like that famous Sao Paulo and other participatory budgeting. So yeah, this is I think one of the ways in which these kind of experiments are being done. Now, there's lots of bumpiness in these experiments. And I was careful to say not all of the experiments are going to succeed. But on the other hand, there's some reason to believe that at least some of these experiments are doing pretty well. So yeah, it's impossible to take this kind of fairly direct form of democratic input and think about how it would work at a neighborhood or township level, as some places in fact are doing.
Yes.
Right. Well, I think what's important about the question, how important is the tribe level here? I think what's important about the tribe is that it gives you a structure in which people need to, or if it's really going to work, will need to actually deal with people who are not from their own small village, and not even from their regional cluster of villages, right? So if we think about it as in a modern university, you can think about departments and schools, and then the university overall. That at some point, sure, a lot of your work is going to be in your local village, and perhaps much of your work is going to be done, in your regional cluster. But for the university overall to do well, arguably there are advantages if people can share what they know, work together effectively, have real trust across the entirety of the organization.
Right, I guess I don't get how that's different from the council as a whole, apart from it's just fewer people. The council as a whole was people who you didn't know and you needed to talk to in order to get things done.
Yeah.
So it's a tribe, somehow like an intermediate administrative unit? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the idea is there are, so everybody in Athens in 508, it's like, we just had this big revolution. The Spartans are more or less marching. We have to think, now what? So we have to have some way to say, all right, we're all in this together. This is what they come up with. Aristotle says that the guy who devised this, a man named Cleisthenes, was seeking to mix the Athenians together. So it seems to be a genuine attempt to somehow get them to feel that they have an Athenian identity and not just a village identity. But I think initially it was meant to say, all right, you could fight together in the same units, in the same battalions, and keep each other's backs that way. I suspect it's originally a military organization, but I think it had, because it's connected to the council, because you have to actually have a way to govern Athens. And you say, all right, well, this is the way we'll govern it. Every little village will have its people on the governing council, or at least the council that sets the agenda for the governing assembly of all citizens, potentially. So I think that's, once again, it's not like Cleisthenes has got this all thought out. But at that point, there you are, the 50 of you who are standing in for, a tenth of the Athenians, so maybe standing in for 3,000 background citizens, and all the people who are associated with your wives and kids and so on. So you're in a position then of needing to somehow do what is necessary that will allow Athens to have the right policies to do business. So how are you going to then work with people that at the stage one you don't have any particular reason to know or trust or want to get involved with? So the idea of the institution is, really it throws you together with people and says you have reasons to want to work with these people.
Nick?
Thank you very much. The Victorian view of Greek civilization was one in which there was a worm in the bud, in which democracy and other forces produced an irresistible movement towards total war, and also a lot of disease, the collapse of economic and social institutions. How is your rather idyllic approach to
Yeah. So this is the nice thing is I'm able.
The U.S. Marines have been reading Thucydides. I'm not sure are they reading over?
Yeah. So the advantage I have over Thucydides is I've lived. I can look back over times that he can't. So Thucydides is writing and basically going to explain why did Athens lose the Peloponnesian War. He's got an argument for why he did. I've written a fair amount on Thucydides. I deeply love Thucydides as a writer, although I don't think he happens to be right about this. Because if you look at if I'm anywhere near right on these numbers, the era of Thucydides around 400 is not the peak of the classical world. It's not the demographic peak. It's not the consumption peak. It's arguably, if you like philosophy, not the cultural peak. So the thing is that just Thucydides was wrong, and democracy wasn't something that was going to inevitably fall into a kind of a nightmarish civil war. I mean, I think Thucydides means you to think that the civil war that he describes in Corcyra in Book 3 is going to happen in spades in Athens, and that is going to be the end of civilization as we know it. What he doesn't know is that this is going to, there's going to be this down here, that's a real crash. He doesn't know it's going to go up again. But it does. And within a generation, Athens is up to a capacity level that is, even after plagues and all the rest of it, that is equivalent to the 5th century. So I know that, he doesn't, so I have some advantages.
One last question from Zoltan or comments?
You mentioned the neo-Hobbesian theory at the beginning. Simply people have that because there are cases where there was strong top-down control and got cooperation. One thing you implied was maybe the Athenian answer doesn't scale up, and that's why, take China as an example, which seems to be the opposite, where you get the strong control uniting the warring states, and then you get this cultural flowering. But I wonder, in the Chinese case, if you look at, well, just my impression really, when was the maximum creativity and flourishing of culture? Probably Song, especially Tang Dynasty, maybe Ming. And that's when top-down control was maybe amongst the weakest. And so I wonder to what extent your ideas actually do apply in some of the cases that might be put as counterexamples.
I mean, what I'd really like to know more about in Chinese history is the so-called spring and autumn period. So this is the period that precedes the consolidation of the Han Dynasty, before the first emperor. And it's a multi-state environment. We really comes into focus for us a little later in the so-called era of the warring states. So by that time, we've got about 4 of these, and one of them, Qing, is going to take over the others, and that's going to become the dominant centralized state. But at least some people have argued that you look at a lot of where the real cultural explosion of early China happens, and it seems to potentially be happening in this spring and autumn period. The problem is that the emperors weren't keen on remembering the spring and autumn period. That's the famous destruction of, how real it was. But at any rate, there's an attempt to sort of suppress the actual history of that period. But the cultural things that have been produced in that period obviously do continue on. So there are other periods of at least small state, relatively republican world of Renaissance Italy, which overperforms once again. So I don't want to suggest that this is the only way forward. I think there are, certainly highly centralized states that have done a lot, have produced there's great novels written in 19th century Russia, a very centralized state. So basically, democracy, you want to think about assuming the cost of democracy if you think these are good things. Right? If these are values that you have independently. If you don't have any of these values independently, you say, no, what I really like is just stability, is changelessness. I like somebody to tell me what to do. Then there are probably other ways to have. But if you think these things really matter, and your goal is continuous innovation, your goal is learning, and you independently value certain kinds of freedom, certain kinds of equality, certain kinds of dignity. My point is, you don't have to sacrifice performance, and you don't have to worry that with Thucydides, that this is all going to fall apart really soon. This is terribly fragile, right? That you can actually have, if you get the institutional structure right, you can have high performance and robustness, and have these things. It's not a trade-off of these things, or high performance, or robustness. But whether democracy will always outperform, I don't think we need to make that argument insofar as some people, just for their own reasons, think these things are worth having. what do you bet? Most people in the room.
Maybe one last quick question. Is it quick?
I wanted to ask about transitions. You talked about transitions to democracy, and particularly from oligarchies to democracies.
Yeah.
I was struck by something you said about someone having the idea of democracy, almost crafting it as a way of creating this Athenian identity, going beyond the village, if you like.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you could say something about the triggers that led from oligarchy to democracy, and whether that was an individual crafting it, or whether it was a collective effort. So I just wondered about the process of transition.
And it's really a fascinating thing. And of course, our sources aren't great. I've written on this fairly extensively, and if you drop me an email, Ober at Stanford EDU, I'm happy to send you some pieces on it. Because I think basically the argument is there was a kind of a legislative intelligence that was involved here, but it wasn't that the legislative intelligence is what is driving the whole process. Basically, what drives the whole process is that there's an initial civil strife. It doesn't really matter. But it's there's some initial civil strife that leaves Athens very vulnerable. Basically, the Spartans try to take advantage of this. They come in to support an Athenian elite and says, okay, why don't you run things in our interest? This sparks a massive uprising. And the massive uprising is surprising. It catches the Spartans by surprise. It catches everyone by surprise. Basically sweeps out the oligarchic gang that was going to run the place in Sparta's interest. And at that point, the guy who was going to turn out to be the architect has been sent into exile. He's not even in Athens when this is happening. But then the successful revolutionaries basically say, okay, Cleisthenes, remember all that sort of stuff you were talking about, big ideas, when you were fighting head-to-head with the guy who called it the Spartans? Okay, deliver. So I think ultimately Cleisthenes is the image I've used sometimes, at least in undergraduate lectures. It's late enough in the evening, I can try it on you. It's basically like, he's a surfer, There's this big wave coming in. And either he's going to get on top of the wave, and he's going to ride it in, or, it's going to dash everything to smithereens. To do that takes a lot of skill, and he actually does come up with these ideas about how to do it, and the Athenians seem to have enough faith in him to say, all right, let's give it a try. But he can't really design something to fit himself as the guy who's really going to run things. And the fascinating thing about Cleisthenes basically drops out of the picture after this initial reform period. We don't hear about him anymore in Athenian history. So it's, yes, there is an organizational intelligence that is there. And I think without that, it's not going to happen. I mean, we need, genius matters in human history. But it's not a matter of somebody waking up one day and saying, what you Athenian needs is democracy. I will bring it to you. And here it is. It's a democracy emerges in a moment of a crisis in which the ordinary people have actually seized control of the situation for themselves. And the only question is it possible to give that revolutionary moment a structure, or is it just going to rip itself apart? So is it going to sort of go off in, is it going to be 1776, or is it going to be 1789 or 1917? I mean, there are moments in which you get the world falls apart, and the question is under what kind of circumstance might it be put back together? And in this case, it's put back together in a way that happens to be very robust.
Okay. Many thanks. Many thanks to Josh for a really very interesting talk, and I think for a lot of food for thought. I'm sure we will come back to. So anybody who is interested, I just want to mention this. Again, the emails did say there will be a seminar tomorrow will be chaired by Sultan Dines from over at Sussex, and it is in Kenshaw 2. Is it the right place? Yeah, I think it is Shawcross. So this, yes, it's something which doesn't mean anything to me, but Shawcross 2 at 1 o'clock to 2:30, which is a sort of seminar discussion meeting with George tomorrow, looking specifically at the development of university organizational forms or institutional structures. So many thanks to everybody coming here, and I'm sure if there's some urgent question left, just come down and ask Josh. But yeah, many thanks to everybody for attending. And I would also like to actually thank in particular Glynis and Anya for, well, helping with our organizing it, and Anya producing a poster for it. So thank you very much to all of you. Okay.